architecture, Rosie. So at any stage, one of you is free to take over from me. My name is Harry Mount, editor of the Oldie. I also write about architectural history and wrote a book about the history of British buildings, which we're going to be talking about, called A Lust for Windowsills. And this is going to be the world's quickest whistle-stop tour through British architectural history involving its roots. Here we have a classical temple in Italy. So basically we go from around about 500 BC to the mid-20th century AD over, I hope many of you will be coming next week, over 2 days, 4 sessions. So we'll be talking till lunch now, 1 o'clock, then we'll have lunch 1 till 2, then 2 till 3 we'll do the second session, and the same next week. Hello, Madeline.
Sorry.
No, on the dot. And if you're such a hot day, if you feel at all under the weather, there's plenty of water next door. My colleague Amelia here, who is also operating the slides, can help you out with water if you're trapped here. And if you need to go to the loo, there's one on the landing right opposite where we came up, just half a floor down. So, I also should say you're not here to enjoy yourselves. This is an intense exam. You'll be examined at the end, and there may be a small consolation prize for those who come top. But I'm sure you'll all completely sail through it, and I'm going to be quizzing you throughout these sessions. So today, hopefully, we're going to completely nail the history of classical architecture. And you will all know there are how many classical orders, Madeline? Madeline's just been to Greece with me, and we saw some of them, but she knows. Anyone have a guess at the?
Three.
Let's say yes. All those answers in a funny sort of way are right. There are 3 Greek orders, which are
Ionic, Corinthian, Doric.
brilliant.
Oh, I didn't realise it was that.
Yeah,
Coming with
it's all coming back to you,
Never
Madeline. So Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, could think of them in that order, are the Greek ones. The earliest surviving Doric columns are from 700 BC. The earliest surviving Ionic ones are from 600 BC. This is very nice, convenient. The earliest surviving Corinthian ones are 500 BC. There is only one. The Romans were so useless, they only had one order, which was composite.
Yeah, I got it.
Fantastic. Well done. You're catching up, Madeline. Still quite low on the leaderboard. Ready to catch up. And at their own admission, the Romans deferred to the Greeks, so they completely admitted they borrowed heavily from the Greeks. And the composite, which we're coming to, is a combination of Ionic and Corinthian. And then there was one Renaissance order, which is Tuscan, I hear you cry, which was in the 16th century, the only order invented in the Renaissance period, even simpler than Doric. In fact, it was nicknamed Gardener's Doric, because if you were going to build your hut in the bottom of the garden, you do it in Tuscan, the most simple order of all. So with that rough overview, I'm going to keep on repeating these things till they're deep within your skulls. So here is the lovely Doric temple at Paestum in Italy. And although it's in Italy near Naples, that was Naples, or Neapolis, Greek for new city, was part of Magna Graecia, Great Greece, colonized by the Greeks from 700 BC. And the temples at Paestum vary from 550 to 450 BC. And here is absolutely fantastic Doric temple at Paestum. Go to the next slide, please. There is a close-up, and the simple thing about Doric is that they are the simplest of orders, often called the male order because we're so simple and plain and idiotic, us men. Very, very simple, strong. The column is fluted, which means those vertical stripes carved into the stone in cylinders. You can just see the division between the cylinders. Plate is placed on top of each other and held together by a mortise and tenon. You'll see when they collapse, they often do. There's often a bit of stone protruding and a hole in the one below. And already the idea of the entablature is established, and the entablature is the grand word for what you get above the column. Then the capital, from Latin caput, capitus meaning head, the top of the column, and then the entablature goes above it, and it has three elements. One is the architrave, which is this plain bit just above the column. Can everyone see and hear all right?
Yes, sure.
And architrave is just like another word for a beam. So that's the sort of base above the top of the capital. And then you have the frieze here. We'll be seeing better pictures of a frieze, which can either be like this series, almost like cartoon strips, which are also called, as you all say, metopes, which are like a series, or you can have a continuous line story like a frieze, and in a temple like the Parthenon, you can all go and see it. For now, anyway, at the British Museum, you have both. You have a frieze, long continuous one, and metopes, series of cartoon strips. So you have architrave, frieze or metopes, and then a cornice. So just like here, this building, and sorry, I should have said about this club, Pratt's early 19th century building, became the club called Pratt's in the 1860s. The steward of the Duke of Beaufort was called Mr. Pratt. This was his house, and the Duke of Beaufort liked it so much he used to come here and bring all his friends, and it became a club, and now it's bought by the Dukes of Devonshire a century ago, and it's still owned by the Dukes of Devonshire today. But so many of our buildings, which we'll be seeing in our course, go all the way back to the, well, in this case, 500 BC. That cornice, that lovely cornice at the top, it doesn't have the whole entablature, it's basically just got the cornice, but that's coming from ancient Greece. The next slide, please. So here is the world's most famous temple and the world's most famous Doric temple, and this is the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens, built in 450 BC by the great Greek leader Pericles, at a time when Greek democracy is kicking off and Athens has become extremely rich, largely thanks to beating the Persians at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, and a sea battle at Salamis in 480 BC, and thanks to the introduction of democratic measures, which began in, is there a chair for you there, sir?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no problem, I hope you can get a view. The democratic measures in Athens were began under somebody called Cleisthenes in 508 BC. All these elements coming together in the 5th century BC, as well as the discovery of silver deposits in Laurium, just outside Athens at the beginning of the 5th century BC, and the move of Athens' port to Piraeus, where you still get your ships to the Greek islands today, in the early 5th century BC. All these elements came together to produce that incredible flowering of not just democracy, but architecture, art, tragedy, philosophy, comedy, everything you could want. And the Parthenon, built in 450 BC, so by that stage, as I said, you could have picked from all three orders: Doric, 700 BC, Ionic, 600, Corinthian, 500 BC. So it's an active choice to choose the earlier, more ancient order, Doric. And the next slide, please. And this is an imaginary view of what the Parthenon would have looked like at the height of democracy, probably more like early 4th century BC. There's the Parthenon, the greatest temple, and this is the Propylaeon, the entrance to the Parthenon. And we'll see, you can't see it here, another side temple, the Erechtheion. So we think about the Parthenon, but there were, it's the most holy point, temple to Athene, thus the name Athens, the most holy point in Greece, in Athens, and the most holy point in the country of Greece. Next slide, please. This is a close-up of the entablature, as it would have been of the Parthenon. So there you see the top of the Doric column, Doric capital, very simple, with the fluting, the vertical fluting. Then the architrave, like the beam, plain beam. And then here is the metopes, so it's not a continuous frieze, it's divided up into cartoon strips. And it is divided by 3 vertical lines, which are called triglyphs. Celia knows it all. She's just being very quiet because he doesn't. I think it might be top of the leaderboard. So these are called triglyphs. Tree as in 3, dividing up the metopes, which you'll see in the British Museum, and above the corner of the pediment, triangular top of the temple. Next slide, please. Here is the same bit today, massively eroded, but showing some of the elements are still there. Lord Elgin didn't remove everything, and there's also quite a lot in the Parthenon Museum, but there's still elements left behind there. In this, we'll be talking a lot about building materials. This lovely golden streaked limestone, where amazingly the quarries are still worked today, just in the hill behind Athens, between Athens and Marathon, 26 miles and 385 yards away. There's a lovely hill, you'll see it as you fly into Athens, and that's where you get this lovely gold streaked limestone, still gold today. Next slide, please. And this is a plan of the classic temple. So you have the outside of the temple here, going around here, and then inside you have a so-called cella, C-E-L-L-A, which is basically just means a covered room. And then, just like in the Christian churches, which would imitate classical temples, at one end you have the holy icon, which would be to Athene, great statue of Athene, which disappeared, made out of chryselephantine material, gold and ivory, was at one end. And you would have just like in some Christian churches, you'd have an entrance way, first a small room, and then a larger room with an inner temple, and you'd have the frieze running along the outside, and then those metopes, the cartoon strip, running along the columns on the inside. Next slide, please. This is again the pediment at the Parthenon. Again, you can see elements of it in the British Museum, but brilliantly they fit people in to the existing architecture. So here you have a god crouching down in the declining wall of the pediment, and there would have once been a horse's head coming out of the corner. So brilliantly fit with metopes below. Brilliantly fitting the sculpture to the shape of the building. Next slide, please. Many people go to the Parthenon, I'm sure all you have, and you're also sophisticated. You will also have been to the Forum next door, where there is a much better preserved building, because the poor old Parthenon was perfect and in immaculate shape until 1672, when it had been taken over by the Ottomans, who had turned it both into a mosque but also an ammunition store. And a Venetian soldier besieging the Parthenon crazily sent a missile into the Parthenon, which hit this magazine store of explosives, leading to what the Parthenon looks like today. The middle third of it is destroyed. There's a great debate as to whether you should rebuild it. I think they should, but the Venetian, who was called Morosini, thank God he didn't aim his missiles just next door to the Parthenon, lower down the hill in the Forum, is the wonderful 415 BC temple to Hephaestus, the god of the hearth. It was for a long time wrongly thought to be called the Theseion, a temple to Theseus, who was the founder, ancient mythical founder of Athens. But you can see it's very much on the same lines as the Parthenon. Another, I'll tell you what sort of order is that? Order of the Doric, yeah, again Doric. So it's like a mini copy of the Parthenon, but next time you go, in incredibly good nick with metopes around the outside, and you can see inside there the cella, the inside temple. Yes.
And are the metopes intact?
The metopes, I think they've been removed. It looks like they've been removed.
Yeah, that's why I asked.
Yeah, I think they have. Next slide, please. And this is the temple next to the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, temple to Erechtheus, the supposed ancient founder of Athens. And this was made just after the Parthenon in 400 BC, and it's got an incredibly early survival of the Ionic column, but also these ladies standing in for columns who are called
Caryatids.
Caryatids. Brilliant. Because they were said to come from Carias in what is now modern Turkey. The next picture, please. This is a close-up of those lovely ladies wearing wonderful Greek costumes, and they are imitating columns brilliantly. The capital, which as I said comes from caput, meaning head, so their heads are actually standing in for practically the capitals with capital tops to them, and there is the entablature with an architrave there. There are tremendous variations, so there isn't actually a frieze here or a or metapies. You can see it's divided up with these little roundels and then an incredibly elaborate cornice. Next slide, please. Showing the influence of ancient Greece on London, Britain, and Europe and America. This is the new St Pancras Church, just up the road by the British Museum, built in 1822 by a father and son partnership called William and Henry Inwood, and it's the Greekest temple in London, in Britain, Greekest church, sorry, possibly in the world. This was the height, we'll be coming on to the Greek revival, but the height of the Greek revival. And in a way it's completely extraordinary that here you have a Christian church which in every one of its elements is imitating pagan ancient Greece. But here are these lovely caryatids. They're actually made of terracotta, where they've got iron cores beneath them which have been rusting away. So iron started to rust and expand, and the poor ladies were beginning to explode. Bits of them for a while were in the crypt of the church, but they've just been restored. And here you can see a very elaborate entablature. And here you can see this incredibly grand tower, and every single element in that tower comes from ancient Greece. The next slide, please.
Which street is it in?
It's on the Euston Road, so if you're if you're sitting at traffic lights, you look out to your left and you see one of those ladies, or all four of them.
But if you're walking,
Your walk, so where Euston Road, practically opposite Euston Station.
Gower
okay.
Street.
Gower Street, yeah, around there.
Gower Street, okay.
Yeah. But so this is the tower, which is, we're used to seeing churches like that, and we'll come on to it later, but the combination of having a pediment, classical portico, and a tower soaring through it is familiar to us. When that was first done at St Martin in the Fields in Trafalgar Square in 1720, it was considered completely shocking, because you would never have had this combination in ancient Greece. You might have had a pediment and a portico, you might have had a tower, but you would never have had a tower crashing through a pediment like that. We've become incredibly used to it. That combination also became very popular on the eastern seaboard of America in the early 18th century. And when James Gibbs first did it, a century before this, at St Martin's in the Fields, it was considered incredibly shocking, but like often shocking, brilliant things, people got used to it very quickly. So this one is following that James Gibbs model, but in an incredibly Greek way. So you've got this pediment here, got these columns which are Ionic. We're going to come on to them in a second. And then this tower, which is completely borrowed from ancient Greece. If you look at these two levels, that level.
What date was this built?
1822. Just recently celebrated its bicentenary. So look at these two sections, this one and this one. Next slide, please. The bottom section is, I might just put your drink down there, because it's getting no. This is the Tower of the Winds, which wonderfully survives in the Greek agora in Athens, built in 50 BC, and it was a weather vane. It was also had a water clock, and it also, these sculptures were sculptures of the winds, the north, south, east, west, north-west, etc. winds. They each had different human characteristics from 50 BC. So that forms the inspiration for the top of the tower at St Pancras. Next slide, please. And then the next level above this is the Karagic monument of Lysicrates in the Forum in Athens from 334 BC. Amazingly still survives. a very good restaurant just here if you're in town, and showing what a show-off he was when Byron, the great Greek hero who died 200 years ago, almost exactly, fighting for Greek independence, when he came here, always a bit of a show-off, he visited this lovely Karagic monument and stayed the night in there, which you could see is actually rather small. He must have been but anyway, so the combination of that and the Chariot of Winds inspired the tower at New St Pancras, just up the road. So showing this Greek craze, particularly in the early 19th century. Next slide, please. And so this is another close-up of the Erechtheum, 400 BC in Athens, and this is one of the earliest surviving uses of the Ionic order. This is considered the Ionic order much more elegant and sophisticated, so it's often considered the female order as opposed to the idiotic plain Doric order. And it's most recognized, well, it has fluting as well. It also has, it's impossible to see, I should have said earlier on, this extraordinary effect on all classical columns where the center bulges out, which is called, you can see you nodding, Celia knows.
I can't remember the word.
It's entasis, and that was this extraordinary thing that the Greek architects worked out. If you were to have straight-sided columns, particularly long ones like that, the eye plays a strange trick, starts to make you think that the sides are going inwards. So they worked out if you bulge outwards, it looks straight. So those look pretty straight to you, but they very slightly bulge out. And also, imperceptibly here, more obviously on the Parthenon, Doric columns are wider at the bottom, gives you greater support, but also it's pleasing to the eye that things should be slightly narrower.
Sorry, what
Yes.
was the name of that again?
So this is called entasis, the effect, E-N-T-A-S-I-S. So this is the side of the Erechtheum there, those nice ladies, the caryatids. Next slide, please. And this is the close-up of the incredibly intricate Ionic capital at the Erechtheum, which amazingly, the records survive of how much it cost to build and who built it. Very largely built with slaves. People don't often talk about Greek slaves, but there certainly were lots of Greek slaves. And you can see here, these are called volutes, or to give them their sophisticated name, twirly-whirly bits, which are often compared to the curls of a young girl. And you'll see again and again and again this technique called egg and dart. So egg, dart, egg, dart, egg, dart, egg, dart. But showing how free, there are no precise rules about these orders. Later on in Renaissance Italy and France and here, people began to formulate great strict rules, but there's tremendous variety within different buildings in Greece. And also another very familiar symbol is the honeysuckle symbol. It's lovely, beautiful honeysuckle here with the fluting below. The next slide, please.
Did they regard it as egg and dart?
I don't think I'm not sure they ever referred to it as that. I think quite often we gave them these names, but I don't think it's actually. The first sort of proper architectural historian is Vitruvius in 1st century Rome. So the Greeks, very little survives of their descriptions of these buildings. This is close up again of the egg and the dart, you see again at the Erechtheum. So I imagine, I don't know, it's a good question, but I imagine it was invented later on as a useful term. Next slide, please. And here is a close-up again of the Ionic column. So again, there's the base, the fluting, I missed out the middle bit, these wonderful Ionic volutes, which can vary in what they look like, but that's the great giveaway to the Ionic column, big volutes. Next slide, please. There is a full picture of the Ionic columns. Here's one with a frieze, as opposed to the metopes. The frieze, like the one in the British Museum, a continuous story. Next slide, please. And then this is our next order, the Corinthian column, which has tiny little volutes. You see there? It's important to notice the size of the volutes, and then combined with acanthus leaves. So Ionic columns don't have the acanthus leaves. Corinthian combines little volutes with the acanthus leaves, which still grow in Greece and Italy and Egypt. When I used to teach at architectural history at an art school in South London, where they were teaching carvers, they grew acanthus leaves there to teach them. But here in our damp climate, acanthus leaves collapse. But in Greece and Italy, stiffer, stand up straighter like that. There again is a classic entablature, the architrave. There it's left blank, the frieze. So there's variety within all these overarching rules, and then a lovely ornate cornice on top. And the Corinthian order was supposed to magically come from Corinth, where we've just been, haven't we, Madeline?
Absolutely.
So we saw many Corinthian columns there, and the idea was that it started there, but there's no way, obviously, of proving that. Get the next slide, please. Here's a good example of the Corinthian column, and this is, anyone name that building?
Pantheon.
Fantastic. The Pantheon in Rome, which was rebuilt many times, and the one that amazingly survives today was built by Hadrian in 120 AD, but there had been an earlier temple built by Marcus Agrippa. That's you can see Marcus Agrippa built this for the fourth time, so there have been even earlier temples in the Augustan period in around about 10 AD. He was the right-hand man of Augustus, thus the joke by, I know he's a toxic figure, Boris Johnson, but one of the few things he is interested in genuinely is classics, and his joke was that when Augustus was in trouble, he'd always call for his right-hand man and shout, "Get Agrippa." And amazingly, the Pantheon follows the same thing, a pediment over a Corinthian portico. Behind it you can't quite see, but there's this very, very low dome made out of Roman concrete, early form of Roman concrete. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It's got an oculus or hole in the middle of it, and they still can't work out how this very low dome supports itself, just how it's how incredibly sophisticated Roman architects were. But so that's a Corinthian column. The next
It
slide.
looks like the facade of the mansion house, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, the mansion house follows exactly that. Yeah, portico plus pediment became, because that was the classic temple front. Now a Christian church. So this is the Maison Carrée in Nîmes, a completely perfect Corinthian temple, around about 7 AD. In it, perhaps because of that lovely southern Provence heat, it's remained incredible shape. But again, the classic Corinthian temple with the entablature there, the pediment there, and there you can see unusually the cellar. That inner room, the walls come right to the edge. So there's tremendous variety in how you can do these temples, but there is overarching rules. Next slide, please.
Are they fluted as well?
We go back again. Let's have a look. Yeah, fluted. Yeah, strong fluting. Yeah, columns don't have to be fluted, but on the whole they were. Next slide, please. And so this is the apocryphal story of the first Corinthian column, which Madeline and I saw in Greece, which was a lady left out a vase, and one day the acanthus leaves started growing up around it. Ba-bam, the Corinthian column. Now this is the bit where it gets complicated, is the difference between the Corinthian column and the composite one, the only one that Romans invented, is seems imperceptible, but it's about the size of the volutes. So Corinthian column has acanthus leaves and volutes. So does the composite column, but the volutes are much bigger, and it's like trying to define an elephant. It's hard to do it until it walks into the room. So whenever you're in Greece or Rome or even London or anywhere, often that can be a confusion, but it's not until you see a composite column you see, oh my God, the volutes are so big, that must be composite. So the next slide, please. This is the earliest composite column, and this is on the Arch of Titus in the Forum in Rome, built in 81 AD, the year that Titus died, and you can see he was the son of Vespasian. So it says here, so the Senate and the people of Rome built this in honor of divine Titus, son of Vespasian, and Vespasian his father. I'm afraid this was after the Romans had put down a Jewish revolt in Judea, but you can see here, this is the earliest surviving composite column. You can tell because although it's much eroded, these massive volumes. So that's the thing, composite, huge volumes. Next slide, please. There is another composite column, a modern one, not sure what it's from, but you can see, when you see one, you know it. Composite, big volumes. Next slide, please. And there we are putting them all together. So this in fact is the Tuscan column, the Renaissance one. The difference between Tuscan and Doric is almost imperceptible, but you can see it's just very slightly more simple. The Gardener's Doric, so Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, that's a good way, Corinthian. Got the acanthus leaves, got the small volutes there, you've got the acanthus leaves and massive volutes. So that's a good way. Putting them next to each other, you can't tell you can very easily tell the difference. If you see them in isolation, sometimes it's difficult. Next slide, please. So this is perhaps the most famous Roman building of all, Colosseum, built in 80 AD, and this is the very good illustration of the hierarchy of the orders, which follows that idea of the chronological history of the order. So Doric earliest, Ionic next, Corinthian next, composite after that. And it became a rough rule of thumb, not always followed in the Roman period, but became religious to Renaissance and British architects later on, that you should put the earlier order at the bottom. So here's a perfect illustration of it. Doric on the ground floor, you can't quite make it out, not very good slide, I'm sorry. Then Ionic, then Corinthian, and then actually up here, this is also Corinthian. So it's not that you're always following them religiously, but the idea is, roughly speaking, you put the earlier ones on the ground floor. Yes.
From an aesthetic point of view.
Yeah.
I mean, is this choice an aesthetic one?
Well, that's a good
Or
point. I
if
think
you reverse them, what would it look
well, I think it seems to be, no one knows for sure, but I think it sounds like there was a reverence for the earlier
right,
columns.
so it's got nothing to do with
That's I don't think so, but it could be that. But that's why at the Parthenon, the most expensive temple, they could have used Corinthian, but Doric, the most ancient orders, was used. It might also be that Doric is simpler and heavier and chunkier, Ionic thinner and more elegant, so you might get the idea of a stronger foundation of the building, but that's conjecture. Yeah, but it kind of works.
Sorry, what date was the composite?
81 AD, so that's why, I mean, if this is 80 AD, so it hadn't quite, as it were, been, it might have been, but the earliest surviving one, that Titus arch, was 81 AD, a year after this. Next slide, please. There it is as a close-up. Sorry, again, not very good. You can see this is the third level. This is Corinthian, and then this is our first view of what's a flattened column called? Pilaster, exactly. So there's a difference between a round column as a column that's up, touching against a wall like that. It's called an engaged column. And they can be engaged to varying degrees. You can have a half engaged column where half of it looks like it's buried within the wall, or 3/4 engaged. But then a flat column is a pilaster. Next slide, please. So there again is just another reminder. Pin up a picture of this by your bathroom mirror in the morning and the evening as you brush your teeth. It's a bit confusing because it's not chronologically correct, but that's the Tuscan one, which was in fact the latest one, the Renaissance order. Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, composite. And you can see, roughly speaking, the entablatures get a little more complicated. Not that much more complicated. Next slide, please. And showing there is great variety. So we're looking back and with the benefit of hindsight, laying down these systems which did exist, but the Romans and the Greeks were very free in these interpretations. They weren't following rules, more like conventions. And this is a slide of Pompeii, obviously engulfed in 79 AD. But if you wanted to build a cheap column, here's one here, which has no fluting, no capital. That might have been knocked off, but actually, so depending on how much money you had, you may not follow the rules at all. You might do your own version of it. Next slide, please. And this is, Celia said you're staying in Covent Garden. You must go and have a look at this on your way home. This is St Paul's Covent Garden, built by Inigo Jones in 1633. Inigo Jones, who will be coming to in a pure chronological way later on, but just to show the great influence of Greece, the classical orders on Britain. Inigo Jones, the first British architect to completely understand the rules of classical architecture. His first building is the banqueting house, it's the Queen's House, in Greenwich, built in 1616. Then his first one in the heart of London, just down the road, is the banqueting house of Whitehall, built in 1619. And a remarkable man of Welsh heritage, brought up in Smithfield, complete genius. He had been on 2 grand tours with the Earl of Arundel in the 1600s, with a copy of the 4 books of architecture, Quattro Libri dell'Architettura by Andrea Palladio, 1508 to 80, the great Renaissance Italian architect. And amazingly, Inigo Jones's copy of that book still survives in Worcester College, Oxford. Quite often it's in exhibitions. And even more amazingly, his ink annotations survive, and they've now turned brown, but he was literally clambering up columns in Rome and the Veneto and Venice and Vicenza, where Palladio did most of his buildings, and he was measuring them, 12 inches round, 24 foot tall. So he came back and he had completely absorbed the classical language of architecture, but didn't just copy it. He came up with his own versions, but getting the rules right. And this is one of the buildings he built, St Paul's Covent Garden, built for the Earl of Bedford. His descendants, the Dukes of Bedford, still own a lot of land in Bloomsbury, and the Earl of Bedford built this church at the east end of the piazza, the first classical piazza in Britain, still there today, although largely rebuilt. And the Earl of Bedford, despite being incredibly rich, was a bit stingy and said to Inigo Jones, well, give me a church, but make it as simple and barn-like as possible. And so Inigo Jones said, I'll give you the most barn-like building on earth, which he thought would please the Earl of Bedford. But actually what he did, it still cost a fortune, but he used the Tuscan order here, this very, very simple order, as I said, the gardener's Doric, to give it a feeling of simplicity, but actually it cost a fortune. It was on a huge scale. And this is also an illustration of, you have these square columns on the side of a portico. They're called antae, A-N-T-A-E, and if you have a portico like that with round columns in the middle, square columns on the side, that's called a portico in antis, the Latin for in the antae. So these are called antae, these square columns, which again have ancient origins. Go to the next slide, please. This is actually a good illustration of those orders of architecture. That's the school's quadrangle in the Bodleian Library. That's Sir Thomas Bodley, who set up the famous library in Oxford in 1602. And that's the Tower of the Orders, so in 1619, so showing how we were enshrining these things as rules just after Inigo Jones with Doric, Ionic, Corinthian composite columns. So we were retrofitting very strong rules of that same principle we saw at the Colosseum. Next slide, please. This again, just showing what variety there is in columns. We're looking at the classic versions, but you can have a square column. Next slide, please. And this is a lovely building, the Athenian Treasury at Delphi. I'm sure many of you have been to Delphi, and because it was such a holy place, holy to the great god of Apollo, all the various Greece was a series of city-states that sometimes got on with each other, sometimes were at war with each other, but they all had different treasuries at Delphi. Delphi was holy to all of them, so there would have been a Spartan treasury as well at Delphi. And this is 480 BC, the treasury, which literally is where you put all your gold and treasure. which is a mini temple. What order is this?
Can't see.
Doric.
Doric.
See? And then again, lovely mini entablature with metopes there, surviving metopes. And this is, the red lines around it, those are columns in antis, square columns either side of the round temple. So that's Inigo Jones was using classical precedent in his St. Paul's Covent Garden. Next slide, please. That's another square column, probably also helpful structurally at the Erechtheum by the Parthenon. Next slide, please. And this is going back to those engaged columns. So that's a, what sort of order is that?
Composite.
Well done, Amelia. Composite column, and that's engaged. You can see it's half engaged. It's as if half the column is hidden within the wall, which it isn't, but that's why it's called half engaged. And this is, you can see there, from a later Christian church. Next column, next slide, please. There is a pilaster, and here's a good example. Now this is when it gets difficult. What sort of Corinthian? Exactly. As soon as they're in isolation, can be a bit tricky, but if that had been composite, that would have been massive, that body. Next slide, please. And this is showing that in the Renaissance, Renaissance is a rebirth of classical values in literature and art and architecture, but they did add on some of their own principles, and one of them was the giant order. And the idea of the giant order, clue in the name, is it's huge, and on a Renaissance building or a 19th century building here, it goes through 2 stories.
Big ladder.
Fantastic. So we're about to see the man who invented it. Next slide. Oh, sorry, that's showing a brick pilaster in Hampstead Garden suburb, showing the early 20th century, showing how long these principles last. Next slide, please. So this is, as you say, this is the Piazza del Campidoglio, at the top of the hill overlooking the Forum, by Michelangelo in about 1500, and there you can see the giant order. So he's the first to do it. Again, seems very obvious to us. Why shouldn't you have a order going through 2 stories? But actually, until then, you'd had it supporting a single story like that. So there were little additions added to the corpus of rules, if you like, in the Renaissance period, and British architecture added on their own little embellishments too. Next slide, please. Another kind of embellishment. This is the Baldacchino in St. Peter's by the great architect Bernini, and here he's used these columns, which are sometimes called barley sugar columns, like sticks of barley sugar, or they're called Solomonic columns, like used in the Temple of Solomon, and we also borrowed those. Next slide, please. This is the porch of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford by Nicholas Stone in 1620, with these wonderful twisting columns, barley sugar columns, or you can just call them twisting columns, or Solomonic columns. Showing this whole course is about British architectural history, and we shouldn't start to say we are more sophisticated than the continent. It's a bit like the John Betjeman joke of be careful before you call Weymouth the Naples of Dorset, because no one in Italy calls Naples the Weymouth of Campania. But so we must acknowledge that we are borrowing from the greats of Greece and Rome, and we add our own little embellishments and catch up quite quickly from the 1600s earlier on with Inigo Jones and Nicholas Stone, but we are the midgets to the great giants of Rome, Greece, and the Renaissance. Next slide, please. This is going back to another great, extraordinary invention by the Greeks, where we were a couple of weeks ago. Madeline, where is this?
That's Epidavros.
Fantastic, exactly. Epidavros, the most perfect Greek temple of around about 400 BC in absolutely incredible condition. I don't think any renovation at all, and everything that we're used to in a theatre now. If you're, Celia said at the theatre, you went to the theatre last night, it was all borrowed from the Greeks. The idea you might have either a semicircle like this or an amphitheatre like the Colosseum, just here, as Madeline and I experimented a couple of weeks ago, right in the middle, and the omphalos, which is like the navel of the arena, was where the acoustics were best, and you could, it was very full when we went there, but I've been there just with a couple of people where you could literally just chat here, and you could be heard up there because of because you've been there, yeah,
and
absolutely,
it's incredible.
absolutely,
Really.
extraordinary.
Where
The
is-
Greeks.
Where is this?
It's in the Peloponnese, Epidavros, on the
Oh.
southeast corner.
Oh, I've been
Absolutely, incredible. And you have these side entrances, which are called parodos or parodoi, which means a sideways way in. It's where we get the word parody from. And then behind here, you can't see it; it's largely gone. Greek theatres would have a backdrop, which was called in Greek skene, S-K-E-N-E, which is where we get the word scene from, where you could hang backdrops on, but also you'd bounce back the sound. Extraordinary miracle of Greece in the 5th century BC. This is 400 BC. How it all happened, no one really knows, but it is extraordinary. From the early 5th century BC, you get this sudden invention of tragedy and comedy, and also the whole lineup of actors. You have a chorus, which we still have, the chorus line, a group of actors together. Many of you will have seen Greek plays, but actually in 5th century BC, before that, they had plays, but there'd be a single actor, literally the protagonist, protos agonos, the one contender, and then you'd have a second actor and a third actor, which we completely take for granted that you go to the theatre when you went last night, so you'd be a bit, well, you could have a monologue from one person, but until the early 5th century BC, that's what you would have had. So they very quickly invented the whole architecture of theatre, if you like. Next slide, please.
How many did it have? Poets?
I think there was 16,000, I think. Unbelievable, yeah. And so this is the lovely 2nd century AD theatre at Palmyra, where you remember in 2015 it was bashed up and there's some horrific killings, public killings of people. I mean, horrible that should be a reason it came back into the public eye, but it's been largely rebuilt, and here is a very good example of a skene, incredibly grand backdrop with a mini pediment and columns, and there you have the arena, which comes from the Latin harena, meaning sand, because that was the sandy bit. You go and do your acting in the arena, in the sandy bit, where we got the word arena from. And the grand seats were down here in the front row, with nice, still very uncomfortable marble, coloured marble seats. Still must have been agony to sit on, but the posh seats, as now, were in the middle of the stalls. Next slide, please. This is the inside of the Colosseum, the grandest of all theatres or place for public exercises, including gladiator battles. They would have naumachia, sea battles, where they would, the floor has now been removed of the Colosseum, but the floor was there, and it could be sealed off, filled with water, and you could have mock sea battles. And just like in that brilliant film Gladiator, you could keep animals beneath the arena, and they could spring up and attack poor Russell Crowe. Next slide, please. And again, a thing we completely take for granted. This is the stadium at Olympia, where the Olympic Games began in 776 BC. I mean, it's almost 3,000 years ago. We completely take for granted the idea that when you run around a track, you have two curved ends at either side, but that was either end. That's what they have there, with posh seating here for right in the middle, just like at Arsenal today, the poshest seats around the centre line. And stadiums and games, we think of the Olympic Games, but there are games across ancient Greece. Next slide, please. And this is the lovely tholos, which basically means a round building at Delphi, a temple around 400 BC, in this wonderful dramatic setting at the temple, all gathered round the temple to Apollo. So people would come here to worship gods, so all these different temples, but they would also have, there's a stadium there as well, a place to have athletic games as well. The men, control your excitement, were naked. Greek for being naked was gymnos, where we get the word gymnasium from. Next slide, please. That's another view of the tholos at Delphi. So again, taking these basic building blocks of classical architecture, but building incredible variety of shapes. You see that's following, what order is that? Doric again, yeah, Doric fluted columns with a beautiful curved entablature with the architrave, the free metopes with the triglyphs and the cornice there. Next slide, please. And that inspired another building, sort of building we're completely used to, the idea of a round colonnade with a round building within it. Again, we're just very used to this, but this is the first Renaissance use of it. A lovely tiny temple, in fact its Italian is tempietto, meaning little temple, and it's in the courtyard of the church of San Pietro in Montorio on the Janiculum in Rome, done by Bramante in 1500, and he's the first to come up with this extraordinarily beautiful idea, which we take for granted now, but a round colonnade with a smaller round dome building in the middle of it, which will inspire some of the greatest buildings in history. Next slide, please. So this is St. Peter's. Very shortly after that, Michelangelo built his dome, very similar to that idea of Bramante's. And then in the 17th century, Bernini added on those fantastic colonnades on the
St. Peter's. Castle Howard.
Exactly. Castle Howard is nailed it. It's completely inspired by that. The idea of having colonnades leading to Castle Howard as opposed to rounding off. You'd have service wings at either end. Blenheim Palace, the same, yeah. Next slide, please. And indeed, our very famous building, St. Paul's Cathedral, built by Christopher Wren after the Great Fire of London in 1666. The first cathedral to be built within a single architect's lifetime. Well, Wren lived till 90, started when he was much younger, and he is ultimately borrowing from Bramante with that wonderful colonnade around the famous dome. In fact, showing that we could add things to these great masters. The dome of St. Paul's is in fact 3 domes. Wren worked out that in order to support this very heavy stone lantern, you'd need a brick cone within that. Although that's lead, that's relatively light, the actual famous dome outline. And then he realized that he wanted to fresco the inside, Sir James Thornhill. But if you frescoed the brick cone, which goes a bit like that within there, that would have been much too high for people down here to see. So he added on, at about that height on the inside, a plaster dome fresco so people can see it. So it's the extraordinary invention of Wren, the architect and engineer, to have a triple dome within it, with a colonnade going round. And the other thing that Wren did, he realized that if you had a colonnade with all these voids like this, the eye, without you thinking about it, which would just go, would flip round and wouldn't stop. So he just had this idea of putting in every 4th void, he'd fill it with a stone alcove, which originally has statues in it, just so you wouldn't notice it, but just so the eye, without thinking, just stops a bit as you go around. You have a question?
No, it's really clever.
Yes, it is. You wouldn't notice it, but it's very imperceptibly. But that's a great illusion. Without you knowing it, it's having an effect.
When you showed the theatre,
Yeah.
it seemed reminiscent of Vicenza.
Right. Yeah, the
Palladio.
Palladio's theatre.
Something,
Yeah.
that one precisely.
Yeah, and that's exactly. I don't know if many of you've been to the fantastic Palladio's theatre in Vicenza, which has this fantastic backdrop that looks like it goes back for miles, using illusions. But that's essentially a skene, a Greek skene, a backdrop, but the most beautiful of all backdrops ever. Next slide, please. Just keep an eye on for our lunch. Yeah, we'll perfect timing, and for the end of our lunchtime talk is at 410 AD. Rome is sacked by the Goths. So there are some poor Roman ladies being sacked by some horrible Goths. And it doesn't happen immediately, but it's a good date to remember. Across the empire, very slowly, there's a collapse, particularly in Britain, of Roman rule. And then you enter the unfairly called Dark Ages, but will come after lunch to prove they weren't quite so dark as you think, with the Anglo-Saxons and Anglo-Saxon architecture in Britain. So it's now time for a lunch and a drink. And sit wherever you'd like.